Hey guys, tonight we're headed back in time. Imagine narrow wooden streets, paper lanterns swinging in the breeze, and the distant sound of sandals clacking along the dirt. It's the Edo period in Japan, somewhere between the 1600s and the 1800s. You're in a city with over 1 million people, and not a single garbage truck in sight. Now picture the smells. You've got steaming bowls of miso soup being slurped, fish being gutted in the open air, stray dogs sniffing the gutters, and trash. Trash is everywhere, but also not. That's the weird thing. Somehow, in this massive pre-modern city, garbage didn't exactly pile up. It moved, it flowed, it changed hands, it got reused, recycled, resold, and if you threw something away, you might just get fined, shamed, or even blessed by a monk. Welcome to Edo's deeply strange, wildly specific trash ecosystem. You probably won't survive this, not because it's dangerous, but because it's just so absurdly complicated. There were entire hierarchies of poop collectors, rules for pickle disposal, superstitions about umbrellas. This wasn't a trash system, it was a social operating system. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to know where you're listening from, and what time it is, post it in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin in a place bursting with energy but also waste. Edo was the beating heart of Tokugawa Japan, a capital city, with a population that rivaled London and Paris of its time. But unlike those grimy European cities, Edo somehow managed to avoid drowning in filth. Why? Because garbage wasn't garbage the way we think of it. It was potential, it was economy, it was order. Walk with me down one of the city's main thoroughfares. It's just after sunrise. Shops are opening. Fishmongers yell their morning chants. A samurai passes you, his sandals crunching against the hard-packed dirt. But look closer, what's that man doing in the alleyway? He's squatting, holding a clay bucket, carefully scooping out last night's waste. Not his waste, someone else's, and he's smiling. That bucket gold. Well, metaphorically. It's night soil, and he's going to sell it. Not to burn, not to dump, but to farmers. You'll hear more about that later, but this gives you the flavor of Edo's unique approach. Every bit of waste had a purpose, or at least a rule. Now shift your eyes to the side streets. You'll see another figure, this one hunched and sorting through rags and paper scraps. She's not homeless. She's a professional part of an entire class of waste sorters who made their living collecting cloth pottery shards and even used paper for resale. There are specialized people for almost every category of trash, and they weren't freeloaders, they were essential. Edo officials recognized that a city this dense needed control. They issued neighborhood regulations. Every district was responsible for managing its own waste. And if you failed, the consequences ranged from public humiliation to steep fines, and in rare cases, even banishment. One popular rule: you had to clean the street in front of your home every morning. Not just sweep it, scrub it if needed. If someone tossed fish guts outside your door during the night, too bad. You cleaned it up anyway. It wasn't about blame, it was about order. And Edo loved order. Now imagine a city where almost nothing is wasted. Even broken bowls weren't simply discarded. They were either mended using gold if you were rich, or sticky rice paste if you weren't, or passed on to people who specialized in broken ceramics. Think of it as early thrift. And it didn't stop with bowls. Wooden sandals missing a strap. Fixable. Paper sliding doors torn by a gust of wind. Patchable. Umbrellas shredded in a storm. Well, there were rules for that too. We'll get to them. The city had no municipal waste department as we know it. But it did have a functioning waste economy, and astonishingly, it worked better than some modern systems. Trash collection was informal but regulated. Scavengers were organized. Entire professions revolved around what others had discarded. Let's stop at a city checkpoint, one of the dozens scattered throughout Edo. These weren't just for checking travel permits, they also monitored the movement of certain waste materials. Transporting ash or poop across neighborhood lines without the right license could get you detained. Why? Because different regions had different buyers, and certain areas were more protective of their waste economies. Even household ash was regulated. The soot from your fireplace sold to farmers or brickmakers. It wasn't just tossed, it was weighed, sorted, and priced. Every household kept a little bin for ash, just like they did for compost or old cloth. And speaking of bins, don't expect neat rows of plastic containers. These were handmade wooden buckets, often personalized, sometimes decorated, and usually locked away indoors. Why? Because if you left your bucket out, someone might steal your garbage. Seriously, it had value. There were even edicts passed down by the Tokugawa shogunate, specifying which kinds of trash needed to be reported. Let's say your house caught fire tragically common back then. Once the flames were out, you had to report what kind of debris was left and who would be responsible for disposing of it. And yes, there were designated fire debris men. All of this, every sweep, every scrap, every rule served one purpose: to keep Edo livable. To keep its tightly packed neighborhoods functioning like clockwork. In a city built almost entirely of wood and paper, cleanliness wasn't just a preference, it was survival. And yet it was more than that. It was culture. There was dignity in trash. There was pride in maintaining a clean front step. There were whole belief systems around what you could and couldn't throw away, and how spirits might get angry if you disrespected your garbage. That's the world we're about to sink into. It's slow, it's orderly, it's a little smelly, but it's also beautiful in its own strange way. So curl up, let your breathing slow, and let's continue with something you probably never thought would be a subject of admiration: the legal ownership of trash in Edo, Japan. Let's keep walking slowly, quietly now, because we're about to enter a part of Edo where the rules get weird. Picture a narrow street, 2 rows of small houses facing each other, each with its own little garden patch and stone step. It's early afternoon. The neighborhood is quiet. A woman leans out and tosses a scrap of torn paper into a bin by her door. She turns, thinks nothing of it. But she's just committed a small legal shift invisible to her eye. Because that piece of paper, the moment she let it go, it wasn't hers anymore. In Edo, Japan, once you discarded something, ownership transferred. Not just socially, but legally. Trash in many forms was a kind of soft currency, and who owned what mattered. That scrap could be claimed collected or even resold, and no one could say it was stolen. Because it wasn't hers, not anymore. Ownership of garbage in Edo was a concept rooted in Confucian logic and feudal practicality. Possessions were part of your household's moral order. Discarding them wasn't just a physical act, it was a statement of detachment. But once you detach the city, your neighbors, local collectors, or even the state had the right to intercept. It's like your banana peel joined the commons. And this transfer wasn't vague or theoretical. It was actively enforced. If you caught someone sifting through your discarded items, you couldn't accuse them of theft. In fact, if you tried to stop them, you could be fined or shamed for hoarding garbage. How's that for a plot twist? Now, picture this: a boy walking past your home eyes on your trash bin. He sees something, maybe a broken fan, maybe a frayed piece of kimono silk. And he reaches in, takes it, tucks it under his sleeve. Perfectly legal. And here's the kicker. Some of those kids were actually part of families who specialized in collecting specific types of household waste. They weren't stealing, they were working. Each neighborhood had its own unspoken waste hierarchy. If you put out paper, it was fair game for the paper boys. If you dumped pottery shards, the local mender might come by. If your ash pile got too big, the ash merchant would sweep it up. But once you discarded it, it wasn't yours to control. And that's where it gets stranger. Because Edo's garbage system was so decentralized, these mini economies developed organically. In some districts, one family might be the exclusive collector of rags for decades, like a family-run franchise of waste. If someone else tried to move in on their territory, it wasn't a legal issue so much as a moral one. Shame, gossip, bad omens. No one wanted to mess with the trash balance. But what happened when garbage became contested? Let's say you tossed out an old pot and someone else claimed it, only to discover it was hiding a crack that rendered it useless. Could you take it back? Could you demand it be returned? Not a chance. In the eyes of the law and social custom, the moment the pot left your hand, it was no longer your concern. its fate cracked, or not belong to someone else. This concept kept the garbage economy moving. It also prevented a lot of awkward, I want that back arguments. Of course not. All garbage became someone else's treasure. Some waste was explicitly claimed by the city, or more precisely by designated guilds and laborers who had official rights to collect it. Night soil, for example, wasn't just sold to anyone, it was contracted. And once you filled your chamber pot and set it outside, it was the property of the soil collectors who would sell it to farmers and compost markets. And you didn't want to interfere with them. They had route schedules and sometimes even escorts. They paid for the privilege of collecting poop, and if you tried to give it away to someone else or dump it yourself, you risked real punishment. Not just shame, but actual legal trouble. Same with ash merchants. They bought the right to collect fireplace soot. So even if it looked like gray dust to you to someone else, it was a controlled material. There were even contracts, written agreements between neighborhoods and vendors, sometimes preserved for generations, outlining who could collect what and when. This might seem overly rigid, but it worked because Edo's economy relied on reuse. Trash wasn't just discarded, it was distributed. Ownership transferred like a river flowing through many channels, and every stop had a rule, a role, or a ritual. Let's visit a communal collection point, usually just a designated corner in a street or a back alley. Neighbors would bring their sorted wastecloth in one basket, paper in another, ceramics in a third. These would be picked up not by the government, but by waste workers who paid for the privilege. They would inspect your discards and sometimes leave behind a token of thanks, like a small candle stub, or a cleaned piece of scrap for reuse. If you gave good waste, you gained good standing. And yes, there were gossip chains around waste quality. A household that threw out spoiled rice or torn undergarments without folding them properly could be whispered about. That sort of disrespect made people uneasy. It was believed that sloppy garbage habits reflected a disordered spirit, and disorder in Edo was contagious. Now let's say you saw something valuable tossed out. Could you take it? Yes, but only if you were fast. Trash had a kind of hot potato urgency to it. Once it hit the pile, it was a free-for-all, but you couldn't dig through other people's waste bins before they had set them out. That was considered disrespectful, like eavesdropping, but grosser. There were even social codes about how to discard something. A broken doll, for example, wasn't just tossed. It might be wrapped in paper and gently placed outside, almost like a funeral. Certain items carried spiritual residue. You had to let them go, but respectfully and publicly. Because if you didn't, someone might take it and spread bad luck. Or worse, someone might refuse to take it, and then you were stuck with haunted garbage. And yes, this happened often enough that there were entire pamphlets about spiritually safe disposal. All of this, the legality, the ritual, the silent transactions, made the act of throwing something away in Edo far more than a thoughtless flick of the wrist. It was a handoff, a rite, a quiet transaction in a loud city. So the next time you drop something in the trash and never think of it again, imagine the opposite. Imagine knowing that everything you discarded might be inspected, claimed, repurposed, or even worshipped. That's how Edo rolled. And now we move from the idea of ownership to one of Edo's most gloriously odd garbage systems, the profitable, pungent, and perfectly legal trade in human waste. We're still in the winding back streets of Edo, where the sounds of life echo in wooden alleyways, and somewhere nearby a rooster is crowing over a city already awake. But what you don't see, what you don't want to see, is what lies beneath the floorboards of every home and behind every public latrine. Human waste. Night soil? Poo, to be blunt. And yet in Edo, this wasn't something to hide. This was value. Let's drop in on a humble home as dawn breaks. A man in rough linen clothing arrives at the rear gate. He carries a pole across his shoulders with two large lidded buckets, one on each end. With a slight grunt, he sets them down and lifts the lid of a wooden chamber pot placed outside. With practiced hands, he scoops the contents into his own bucket, careful not to spill a drop. He bows politely to the housewife who's sweeping the path and moves on to the next house. This man is not a criminal. He's not a servant. He's a professional. He is part of Edo's golden poop economy. Here's how it worked. Edo didn't have modern plumbing, and flushing toilets weren't even a concept yet. Instead, people relieved themselves in chamber pots or over-squat toilets set up above clay collection basins. These needed to be emptied regularly, and no, the government didn't do that. Specialized collectors did entrepreneurs really who paid households or landlords for the right to collect their human waste. Why? Because it was fertilizer. Rich, smelly, incredibly effective fertilizer. And farmers on the outskirts of Edo were eager, sometimes desperate, to get their hands on it. In fact, human waste was so valuable that competition for its collection could spark serious arguments. Some collectors had exclusive contracts with neighborhoods or property owners. Others tried to undercut their rivals by offering better prices or more frequent pickups. There were even cases of late-night sneaking people trying to poach poop before the official collector arrived. A bucket of well-fermented night soil, especially from a wealthy household with a high-fiber diet, could fetch a good price. The quality of one's waste wasn't exactly a dinner table topic, but it was noticed by collectors. They developed an eye and a nose for top-tier material. Let's pause on that idea. People knew the quality of your poop. It was part of your household reputation. Landlords even factored it into rental agreements. In some tenement districts, the right to collect tenants' waste went to the landlord, and that income offset lower rents. So in a way, you were paying part of your rent in poop. This setup led to fascinating economic side effects. Large families produced more waste and thus attracted higher value from collectors. That meant landlords often preferred renting to bigger households, even if the space was cramped. Your kids might be loud, but they were profitable nutrient-wise. The transportation of this waste followed strict protocols. Collectors used sealed buckets carried on shoulder poles and traveled carefully to avoid spills. There were rules about when and where they could move the waste, often during early morning hours when traffic was light. You didn't want to slip on the bridge during rush hour. That's the kind of splash nobody needed. Collectors took the night soil out to surrounding farms. There it would be mixed with water straw and animal manure to create a powerful compost. This was then applied to rice fields and vegetable plots. Farmers often prearranged deliveries and even paid more for waste from specific neighborhoods. Waste from merchant districts was particularly prized, likely because of the varied, well-fed diets found there. And yes, farmers ranked the waste. There were grades, like wine or cheese, or really bad metaphors. Now, was it dangerous? Did this lead to disease? Surprisingly less than you'd think. Edo's population was relatively healthy given the circumstances. That's partly because the waste wasn't used raw, it was composted and aged before application. Still gross, yes, but effective. Let's return to the collectors. They were often men of lower caste or from outside the main social orders, yet they provided one of the city's most essential services. Without them, Edo would have drowned in its own filth. And many became modestly wealthy through their work. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, steady, and weirdly respected. In fact, some collectors formed their own guilds. These guilds negotiated rights, set prices, and even arranged apprenticeships. That's right, poop apprentices. Imagine being 15 and told you'll be following Old Man Sato on the collection route today. Watch how he lifts the lids. There were even seasonal rhythms to the trade. Summer waste was more fluid due to both diet and temperature, so transportation was trickier. Winter waste froze, which made scooping easier but carrying heavier. Collectors had to adjust technique with the seasons, and skilled ones knew how to time their routes to maximize efficiency. Meanwhile, in the city, households were expected to keep their toilet areas clean and accessible. If your chamber pot was full past its mark or poorly maintained, collectors could refuse service and your neighbors would hear about it. Clean toilets weren't just a hygiene issue, they were a mark of social respectability. Now and then, a household would try to bypass the system. Maybe they'd dump waste into a canal or bury it in a yard. This was illegal, and if caught, the punishment could include public scolding or fines. Worse, if it contaminated a neighbor's space, that neighbor had the right to demand compensation. So even if you were tired of waiting for your collector, you couldn't just go rogue. On the other side of this, there were rules about over-collecting. If a collector tried to take more than they had contracted for, say, sneak some extra buckets from an unattended chamber pot, they could be reported and fined. The waste economy ran on trust contracts and daily repetition. Strangely, it was a system that linked city to countryside with invisible threads. Your lunch today became tomorrow's fertilizer for someone else's daikon radish. The circle of waste was also a circle of sustenance. Imagine that a city that not only embraced its own waste, but elevated it into a market. A poop-powered economy humming behind the scenes, making sure Edo's fields were green, and its streets were well not clean exactly, but not disastrous either. So next time you flush, think of Edo. Where flushing was a privilege, waste was wealth, and chamber pots were just another piece of city infrastructure full of promise. Now that we've scooped up Edo's most fragrant business, let's look at another crucial part of the trash ecosystem. The humble but brilliant rag dealers and pot menders who turned shredded shirts and cracked dishes into gold. Step softly now, our feet crunch over fine gravel as we wind deeper into the alleys behind Edo's merchant quarters. The morning air smells faintly of smoke and vinegar, and here and there scraps of fabric flutter from wooden pegs. Not trash, not decorations, just signals. You're about to meet one of Edo's least flashy but most essential recyclers, the rag dealer. Let's crouch near the edge of a stall where a man is carefully folding what looks like rags, but you notice the precision in his movements. He's not making piles, he's categorizing. Cotton here, hemp there, silk remnants in a separate box, tiny as they are. These are valuable. The rag dealers, or nunogai, were the unofficial librarians of the city's textile afterlife. When cloth got too worn to repair, when a kimono became a mop or a curtain, was patched past recognition, it still wasn't trash. No. Edo people didn't discard fabric lightly. Every thread still had life in it, and the rag dealer was the one to unlock that final chapter. People saved even tiny cloth remnants, finger-sized squares, because the rag man would buy them. Prices varied depending on fabric type, cleanliness, and size. And yet, people would launder their trash cloth before selling it, because presenting dirty scraps was considered bad manners. Also, clean cloth fetched a better price. So let's say your family's kimono was finally beyond repair. It had seen too many festivals, too many winters. You'd cut it into manageable pieces and call on the local rag dealer. He'd arrive with a bamboo scale and a quiet sense of purpose. Each piece would be weighed, examined, and sorted. In return, you'd get a few coins, maybe a pinch of salt, or sometimes even repurposed cloth for cleaning, because nothing was ever thrown away without a trade. What happened to these rags? Some were resold directly to papermakers, candle makers, or even peddlers of kindling. Others were passed on to specific professions that needed cloth for industrial use. Candle makers used them to filter wax. Ink printers used soft cotton to wipe their plates. Even theater troupes bought fabric scraps to patch costumes or use as rags backstage. But the most poetic reuse paper. The best handmade paper in Edo came from old cloth. That's right, your letters, receipts, even poetry might be written on ground-up pressed and reformed rags. It was called washi, and it was soft, durable, and distinctly fibrous. You could read a haiku on paper that once draped over someone's shoulders during a rainy summer festival 10 years ago. Now shift your gaze to a man crouching near a broken pot on a back stoop. He's got a small metal pan, some soot, and what looks like powdered shell. He's a kintsugi apprentice, but he's not using gold. He's practicing the far more common art of mending everyday ceramics with rice glue, ash paste, and lacquer. This is the world of the Utsuwa Naoshiya, the pot menders. They roamed neighborhoods listening for clinks or clunks from kitchen bins. If someone dropped a bowl, they didn't throw it out, they placed it aside and waited for a mender to pass by. Pot menders were traveling artisans. They carried small toolkits and fixed chips cracks or entire breaks using minimalist techniques passed down from mentor to apprentice. Some simply filled cracks. Others added little metal staples, tiny butterfly clamps that pinched ceramics back into working shape. And yes, a bowl with 3 or 4 clamp marks was totally normal to eat from. Why not just buy a new bowl? Because bowls weren't cheap. And more importantly, mended bowls were seen as full of history. If you served guests in a patched teacup, it wasn't shameful. It was humble. Elegant even. The phrase crack of wisdom came from the belief that repaired things carried the story of their breakage and their survival. Sometimes a mended bowl would even be worth more than an unbroken one if the repair was artful. This wasn't just recycling. This was emotional salvage. Let's not forget umbrellas. Paper umbrellas, wagasai, were prone to wear and tear, but their bamboo skeletons were beautifully made and expensive to replace. So, umbrella menders would canvass the streets after rainy days, offering services to patch holes, recut paper layers, or reinforce the joints. Some had family clients they'd served for decades. Ah, old Lady Hoshino's parasol again. Same leak near the third rib, and off they go. These menders were sometimes also rag dealers or shared a small trade network. An umbrella patch might be made from rags purchased from a kimono scrap 2 blocks away. A bowl clamp might be created from recycled wire salvaged from a discarded lamp. This whole city was a pulsing, breathing, stitched-together web of reuse. And if a pot truly couldn't be saved, if it shattered too finely to mend, those shards weren't thrown out either. They were collected for use as drainage tiles in gardens or crushed to make fine grit for mortar and stucco. There was always a next life waiting. Now imagine a child watching this process. Maybe a curious 8-year-old crouching near the pot mender asking, "What if it breaks again?" And the mender not unkindly says, "Then I come back. It was a cycle, a loop. One that taught patience, resilience, and the quiet dignity of keeping things whole." This culture of repair did more than reduce waste. It created jobs, strengthened community ties, and honored objects. A chipped cup wasn't a failure, it was a memory. A rag wasn't trash, it was a seed. So, as we leave behind the tinkers and tailors of Edo's trash world, we head toward a different realm. One of ash and soot, where the waste from every hearth and hibachi becomes a silent trade of gray powder and black gold. The city begins to exhale as morning folds into midday. Smoke coils gently from rooftops. Women stir stew pots. Tea water simmers. Beneath all this domestic comfort is something easy to miss. Something gray, soft and fine as talcum. Ash. Ash was everywhere in Edo. From the charcoal stoves used to cook rice to the tiny hibachi braziers used for warmth, nearly every household generated it daily. And just like everything else in this precision clockwork society, even the ash had its own economic role. You'd think ash is useless. It's what's left after everything else is gone. But in Edo, ash was a tradable good. Its collection, sale, and reuse were part of a quiet but highly structured economy that smoldered right beneath your feet. Start in a typical tenement home. A mother has finished cooking rice for breakfast. She waits for the coals to cool and then carefully sweeps the ash from the kamado, the earthen stove, into a wooden container. She doesn't dump it in the street. She saves it. This family has a routine every third day a collector passes through. Not a trash man, and Heiya, an ash collector. He's one of the many quiet men who walk Edo's alleys with a low cart and a thick dust cloth tied over their mouths. The air they move through is delicate. One misstep, and the powder flies. But they're used to this. They wear soft sandals. They move like cats. The mother hands him her ash bin. He inspects it, running calloused fingers through the powder. White ash light clean means good charcoal and even burning. Blacker ash or clinkers indicate poorly managed fires. Still usable, but worth less. He offers her a few coins, then pours the contents into a larger barrel on his cart, packed like layers of sediment, each household's ash forming another thin stratum in his quiet empire. Where does all this ash go? Some of it goes to farmers. Wood ash is high in potassium and helps condition acidic soil. Mixed with compost or night soil, it forms part of a balanced fertilizer blend. It softens the earth, neutralizes rot, and helps roots breathe. Farmers prized it especially from wealthier households where better quality charcoal was burned. Some ash went to soap makers and dyers. Yes, Edo had soap primitive but effective, and wood ash was part of how it was made. Mixed with water ash forms lye which could be used to scrub bleach or even tan hides. Other ash went to paper makers who used it as a gentle abrasive during the smoothing of hand-formed sheets. And some ended up in the hands of lacquerware artists and potters who needed fine, neutral ash as a polishing medium. Even tofu sellers found a use for it. They sometimes used wood ash, water, nigiri ash to help coagulate soy milk in place of brine. But wait, it gets more specific. There were specialists in ash. A dealer might specialize only in ash for paper making, and knew exactly which neighborhoods produced the finest grade, maybe the district where artists lived and burned particular incense woods or sandalwood charcoal. Another might focus on farmer supply, preferring bulk even if the quality varied. Some ash dealers blended batches. Others kept sources pure. They wrapped their goods in soft washi paper bundles or stored it in earthen crocks to keep it dry and ready for transport. This wasn't chaos. It was taxonomy. And households knew their reputation depended on their ash too. Just like poop. If your family's ash was clean, dry, and free of charcoal chunks, it suggested good fire-keeping evidence of order and economy in the home. Letting your fire burn wild and produce nothing but clinker lazy. Wasteful, uncivilized. Children were taught to tend fires properly, partly for safety, but also to produce better ash. You weren't just learning how not to burn the house down. You were learning how to make market-grade residue. Let's not forget merchants. Some shopkeepers kept their own hearths and would sell their ash directly to other businesses, skipping the collector. Others stored it for bartering, trading ash for cloth or lamp oil. In a society where money wasn't always liquid and bartering was common, ash became a form of soft currency. Then there was the baya, a rarer figure, the ash purifier. He processed bulk ash, sifted it through silk screens, dried it in sun-heated clay pans, and sold it at a markup. Some even scented it with dried herbs. Imagine buying artisanal ash, hand-graded and delicately perfumed. In Edo, this was not absurd. This was Tuesday. Ash collectors also doubled as intelligence agents of a sort. Just as rag dealers knew who was getting rid of valuables, ashmen knew who was burning more fuel than usual, who might be hosting guests who'd switched from pine to oak, who was stockpiling kindling in anticipation of a family death or a winter illness. Because fire was ritual. It was seasonal. Ash was evidence. You could read a neighborhood by its ash output. A collector might say, the Nakamura house is using better charcoal this week. A wedding, maybe. Some wealthier families separated their ash types. Cooking ash in one bin. Tea ceremony ash made from ultra-refined white charcoal in another. That tea ash premium stuff. Used in incense preparation or given to monks for ceremonial fire offerings. In fact, temples often bought ash for religious rituals. They burned it again, mingled it with incense, and used it in purification ceremonies. So your breakfast fire might become part of a prayer 2 weeks later. There were even etiquette guides, little handwritten manuals that advised on ash manners. How to store it. When to offer it. What not to do. Don't mix it with garbage. Don't dampen it. Don't leave it exposed to wind. Clean ash was a sign of a clean soul. And when a collector finished his day, he'd head toward one of the wholesale ash yards on the city's edge. There, giant bins sorted the city's ash by grade and destination. A farmer's cart waits nearby. A dyer shuffles in. A paperman nods politely. They all reach into those same gray bins and pull out the past lives of hundreds of stoves carefully transformed. So you see in Edo, even the smoke trail that curled from your kitchen had a destination. Ash wasn't the end of something, it was the beginning of a new cycle. It grounded plants, purified rituals, scrubbed tools, and bound the city together in quiet, invisible trade. And now as our nostrils sting faintly from all this soot and smoke, it's time we step away from the ashes and walk towards something less powdery but no less strange. The controlled chaos of street sweepers, alley monitors, and the perfectly ranked trash heaps of Edo's public order system. We leave behind the soft hush of ash and step onto Edo's busy streets again. This time we're not following merchants or craftsmen. We're watching the ones who watch. The silent sweepers. The alley overseers. The trash patrol. It's mid-afternoon now and the alleys of Edo are never still. Children run past sandals slapping. A noodle vendor calls out. A cat slips behind a cart. And just then, with barely a sound, comes a man with a straw broom tied over one shoulder and a cloth badge tucked into his sash. He's one of the Machi Baikshi or neighborhood fire watch volunteers, but today he's also acting as a sanitation monitor. Wait, fire watch and trash duty. Yes, in Edo, many civic roles wore multiple hats. Public safety was tightly woven into the rhythms of cleanliness. Because where there was clutter, there was danger, especially fire. These men, drawn from the local townspeople and rotated by district, carried not just water buckets and fire poles, but also responsibility for the tidiness of streets, alleys, and public spaces. They watched for unattended trash heaps. They noted who dumped sweepings near the riverbanks, and they kept tabs on alley drains, the lifeblood of sanitation, in a city that feared both fire and plague. So picture this. You're sweeping your shop front. You collect dust leaves, maybe a broken sandal thong. Where do you put it? You don't just leave it out. No. You've got to deposit it in the designated Gomi Yashiki, a small neighborhood waste plot usually managed by a few elders and closely watched. These weren't big. Just a fenced area or a marked ground space covered in pebbles or rice straw where waste could be sorted before pickup. But this waste wasn't chaotic. Even trash was categorized. Organic waste kitchen scraps, wilted vegetables, fish bones went into compost bins. Human waste had its own collectors. Fabric waste went to rag dealers. Ash was sifted. That left mostly broken wood, worn-out straw sandals, and occasional unrepairable ceramics. These were arranged, sometimes even stacked in neat little rows. In fact, neighborhood waste piles could be inspected, yes, judged for orderliness by civic patrols or even local officials. A disorderly trash plot reflected badly on the whole block. That's where another figure comes in, the Kumi Gashira. Think of him as your neighborhood captain. He lived among the people he helped manage and acted as a kind of micro-mayor. The Kumigashira coordinated cleanup days, distributed communal brooms and ladles, and ensured that no one snuck trash out at night to dump it in someone else's zone. Because yes, trash cheating happened. Some households tried to offload waste just beyond their border, hoping another neighborhood would bear the burden. But the Kumigashira kept watch. Sometimes even disputes arose. That broken umbrella wasn't ours, it came from across the canal. Heated arguments, flapping sleeves, gesturing fans, and then inevitably the trash would be sorted, claimed, or fined. Fines. Oh yes, the Tokugawa government issued edicts about trash. There were rules. Break them and you could be fined, reprimanded, or publicly shamed. A samurai might lose face if his servant discarded waste improperly. A merchant's stall could be inspected. A vendor could lose customers if his refuse bin smelled wrong. Every neighborhood had cleanup days. Sometimes weekly, sometimes more often after festivals or seasonal changes. The Kumigashira would lead the effort, and households regardless of class were expected to participate. Children fetched water. Housewives scrubbed drains. Men lifted larger debris into communal carts. These carts, drawn by kagoya, or hired haulers, would take the refuse to designated dumping grounds at the city's edges. But these weren't free-for-all dumps. They were layered systems, and each type of waste had its place. Wood and bamboo scraps were often collected for fuel or reuse. Sandals might be stripped for the cordage. Ceramics were crushed, and any cloth fragments missed by rag dealers were burned in small, supervised pits. Burning trash was tightly regulated. Fires could not be lit casually. Special burn zones existed, and they operated under strict supervision, often with a water barrel nearby and multiple watchers on hand. Any smoke seen rising from an unauthorized lot could trigger a neighborhood inspection. Nobody wanted that. Even street sweeping followed patterns. Main roads were swept daily, often by assigned teams, funded by merchant guilds or local temples. Side alleys were cleaned by residents. Everyone swept the area in front of their own home or shop, including the edge of the street. There was a saying, a clean front means a clean heart. And yes, there were street sweepers as a profession. Often elderly men, retired samurai, or laborers looking for modest pay. They wore conical hats and carried brooms made from bundled rice straw. Their rhythm was quiet, just a swish, a scrape, a whisk, all day in loops. No fanfare, just clean lines of dust brushed to the curb. Children, too, were often tasked with sweeping. After school, they'd clear temple steps or shop entrances. It wasn't punishment, it was routine. Training, community pride. And the streets. They sparkled in the morning sun. There were even trash legends. One involved a mysterious woman who left bundles of folded paper near the river, each tied with red thread and stuffed with dried fish skin. Superstitious types believed they were curses. The Kumigashira investigated. It turned out to be an elderly widow trying to feed stray cats but embarrassed to be seen. She was quietly asked to find a more discreet method. Another tale tells of a sandal repairman who built a shrine from broken geta, stacking them like wooden Jenga pieces until he had a 7-foot tower. Pilgrims started leaving coins at its base. City officials asked him to take it down. He refused, and locals defended him. Eventually, it was declared a cultural curiosity and allowed to stand. That's the thing. Even within the strictness of Edo's trash culture, there was space for strange affection for local color, for weird little rules that everybody knew, but nobody wrote down. Like how one district always painted their trash bins blue because a merchant had once spilled indigo dye over a whole pile and decided it looked nice. Or how another neighborhood had a secret code of arranging trash based on which direction it faced toward the river if it was festival week toward the mountains otherwise. Nobody remembers why, but they still do it. And all of it, every broom stroke, every folded cloth, every measured bundle was part of Edo's incredible choreography. A city where trash didn't just disappear, it was witnessed, watched, reordered, honored. Now let's step from the alleyways to the water's edge. Because if you really want to understand Eto's garbage rules, you have to understand the canals, the rivers, the slow-moving arteries of waste trade and transformation. The air thickens with the scent of river water tinged with a trace of wet wood and faint decay. We are at the edge of the city now, where Edo exhales its breath into a network of canals that lace its body like veins. If the alleys were its capillaries, here are its arteries, the living flow of refuse trade and renewal. You might expect the rivers of a pre-modern megacity to be murky disasters clogged with debris filth bobbing at every turn. But this is Edo. Things are strange here. Controlled. Even the garbage floating in the water has a destination and a watcher. Let's begin with the basics. Edo was a city of water. Built around the Sumida River, it had hundreds of canals, streams, moats, and tributaries. Goods came in by boat. People traveled by boat, and yes, trash moved by boat too. But not any trash. Not the kind you'd think. It wasn't permitted to simply toss garbage into the water. That would have been a civic offense, a breach of both sanitation codes and neighborly etiquette. Throwing waste into the canal wasn't just frowned upon, it was monitored. Punishable. Water inspectors were real patrolling in small flat-bottom boats watching for floating offenders. Instead, canals were used like conveyor belts moving select packaged and intentional forms of waste downstream, often toward designated dumping islands. Yes, islands. Because Edo didn't bury all its trash. It built land with it. Take Yuma no Shima, the Island of Dreams. It didn't exist at first. Neither did a number of other artificial islands in Tokyo Bay. They were created over decades by controlled dumping of debris, burnt wood, broken ceramics, sand, bundled straw, and even layered compost. Trash as architecture, waste as foundation. Waste. Boats brought refuse downriver. But it wasn't random. Merchants, builders, and even civic agencies used the canals to send out specific loads, cleared rubble from a demolished wall garden, clippings to Tommy fragments beyond repair. These were loaded carefully, lashed with rope, and moved by barge to dumping grounds. At the other end, teams of laborers, shimahoroshi, or island unloaders received the cargo. They worked in tight lines, unloading bundle after bundle, stacking the materials by type. Straw with straw, wood with wood, dirt with dirt. Occasionally charcoal remains or worn sandals made their way in as filler. Everything had a place. Island building wasn't fast. It took years, even decades, to stabilize a base. Layers were soaked, tamped, weighed down with stones, and eventually topped with fresh earth brought in from riverbanks. Once solid, these islands were used for military storage gardens or even small shrines. Back in the city, proper canal banks were watched carefully. Each neighborhood abutting the water had duty rotations to keep its edge clean. A single stray cabbage leaf might trigger suspicion. Did someone slip kitchen scraps into the water? Was a merchant rinsing out dye pots upstream? And the dye makers, oh, they were closely watched. Indigo in particular was a huge industry in Edo, but its runoff was rich with chemical residue. So dyers had to pre-treat their wastewater before it reached canals, often with charcoal filters or temporary holding pits. The penalty for polluting fines, business suspensions, even confiscation of goods. Same for tanners and brewers. These industries generated waste animal fats, rice husks, fermenting mash, and while some of it could be recycled, the rest needed regulation. Large producers had agreements with river haulers who ran designated trash barges downstream at night. These nighttime trips became almost ghostly routines. Silent barges gliding past lantern-lit bridges, oars barely splashing, no shouting. Just the soft thunk of bundles dropped on deck and the ripple of a practiced hand steering past torii gates and stone piers. The canal itself was a social space, too. Children caught crayfish in the shallows. Women washed vegetables at the edge using special bamboo baskets to keep produce from floating away. Every act along the water was watched by someone else. Mutual visibility was a kind of civic hygiene. No one dumped trash if someone was watching. And someone was always watching. Even the river gods were part of this order. Small shrines dotted the canal routes, tiny altars with foxes or river spirits, sometimes tucked under bridges. Offerings were made to protect the water's flow and keep it clean. To dump trash in front of a shrine, unthinkable. Even criminals avoided that. Speaking of criminals, river patrols had another job policing illegal trash disposal. Some people tried to bribe boatmen to take extra bundles off in night soil or spoiled goods. But the patrol's part of the Doshin Corps had eyes everywhere. And the penalty's not jail usually. Public humiliation. You might be tied to a stake near the canal edge with a signboard around your neck. Improper disposal of refuse. A few hours in the sun beside your own shameful waste did the trick. Lesson learned. The message. Even the water must be respected. And it wasn't just punishment that kept people in line. There was also pride. Canalside communities often competed for cleanliness. Some hired extra sweepers. Others planted willows or built low wooden fences to keep children from tumbling in, and also to prevent litter. On New Year's Day, some neighborhoods floated flower boats downstream, their surfaces decorated with pine and plum. A thank you to the river for another year of service. You might ask, did nothing ever go wrong? Of course it did. Sometimes heavy rains overwhelmed the drainage ditches. Silt clogged outflows. Insects bred in stagnant pockets. And then city workers would be dispatched scraping muck, cutting back reeds, dredging the shallows. These workers wore leg wrappings, wide straw hats, and always carried long-handled rakes. A dangerous job. Sharp objects, foul smells, deep mud. But it was done. Silently. Repeatedly. Because that was Edo. A place where even filth had a pattern and even rot had dignity. At the canal's end, the last bundle tumbles into a barge. It floats quietly away, headed for some distant island, still half-formed, still waiting. And just like that, your morning sweepings are no longer yours. They become part of the city's secret infrastructure, a floating legacy of clean streets, careful neighbors, and a river that was never just a river. Next, we'll dive into the labyrinth of Edo's marketplaces where the garbage wasn't just removed. It was managed, traded, repurposed, and sometimes even fought over. The scent of pickled radish and grilled eel is strong, but somewhere beneath it all is the sharp tang of refuse waiting to be reborn. The sun climbs higher, and the streets thicken with life. You're no longer in the quiet alleyways or on the hush of canal banks. Now you stand at the pulsing heart of Edo's commerce, its bustling ichiba or marketplaces. A patchwork of awnings, yelling vendors steam from soup pots and barrels stacked higher than your head. This is where money changes hands in handfuls of coins, and where trash builds up faster than rice balls disappear. Here, garbage is different. It's alive. Not passive leftovers, but raw material economic fuel, a kind of invisible inventory. Let's look at a rice stall. The vendor sells steamed rice in neat wooden boxes. Every customer brings back the box later washed. If not, they pay a cleaning fee. Why? Because wood boxes, if mistreated, attract mold. Mold equals trash, trash equals loss. So the vendor's goal is zero waste. Trimmings from wrapping papers are saved. The ash from the vendor's tiny cooking stove is swept and sold. Even the rope ties from rice sacks are untied carefully and bundled to sell to the rope dealer down the lane. Next stall over fishmonger. The scraps, the heads, bones, offcuts are sorted. The freshest are sold as animal feed to chicken coop keepers. Bones go to artisans who make fishing hooks and needles. Only the truly foul bits already beginning to turn are packed in rice husks and sold cheaply as bait for river fishing. Nothing is thrown away, not yet. You smell the mix. Soy vinegar, charcoal smoke, a hint of rotting cabbage. But it's organized chaos. These marketplaces, Nihonbashi Asakusa Kanda, they don't function without a second economy, the scavengers. Not beggars, not vagrants. These are specialized workers, the kuzukai or trash buyers. Ragmen, ash sellers, bone collectors, broken dish buyers. They weave through the crowd calling out softly, kuzu, kuzu, ash, and scrap. They carry sacks over one shoulder and scales at their waist. When a vendor has trimmed too many green onions or cracked a tray, a kuzukai appears, inspects the pile, and offers a price. A few mon coins. The vendor nods. The trash is gone, but it doesn't disappear. It moves. These collectors don't hoard junk, they sort process and sell up the chain. The ash goes to a pottery shop to temper clay. Rags are washed and sold to papermakers. Bones are bleached in vinegar and resold. Even broken ceramics are crushed and used to reinforce roadbeds or mix into new clay molds. You begin to see at this invisible circuit humming at just below the surface. There's a man who does nothing but buy used straw sandals. Waraji. He collects them from market workers, porters, pilgrims. He repairs what he can, reties what he must, and sells them to field workers who don't need pretty sandals, just something to keep thorns out of their soles. His shop smells of feet and glue. His profit is tiny but steady. In the corner is a tofu vendor. His leftovers, the curds too soft to sell, are scooped into a bucket. A waiting woman takes it away. She's a pig farmer's daughter. The pigs eat tofu dregs plus spoiled rice plus discarded vegetable tops. That pig will grow fat. It will be sold next winter. Its waste will be collected too. Another loop begins. Now pause. Look down. The market street is swept continuously. You see it happen. A boy with a short broom makes laps. He's paid in meals by the vendors. His job is to keep their customers from stepping in anything foul. He sweeps up errant scales, discarded cabbage leaves, broken toothpicks. At the end of his shift, he brings his sweepings to a central pile behind the market. A team of elder men arrives with carts. They sort the pile. They remove reusable chopsticks. They inspect wrappers for intact cloth. They even test leftover sauces, some of which can be boiled down and sold in bulk to poorer neighborhoods as seasoning. Don't laugh! In Edo, waste wasn't a shame. It was a ladder, a livelihood. There were fights too. Competition. One rag collector accuses another of poaching territory. A fishbone seller suspects a rival of watering down his vinegar. Arguments over access to the best market scraps could get heated. Once a rumor spread that a kuzukai had mixed human bone in with his pig bone bundles, bad luck superstition forbidden. His business vanished for months. Some marketplaces even developed their own internal garbage guilds. Small self-organized associations of collectors who set rules when to enter, what scraps to touch, how to divide certain finds. A ceramic shard found under the fish stall. That's the jurisdiction of the shard dealer, not the rag collector. Boundaries kept the peace. There were also ranking systems. The higher-class kuzukai had carts, sometimes apprentices. They wore cleaner robes, kept books. They sold to papermakers, dye houses, metalworkers. Lower-class scavengers walked barefoot, carried bundles on their back, dealt in smaller finds, still useful but less reliable. Some did both, scavenge by day, resold by night. Kids learned these trades early. A boy might start helping his father sift ash for iron nails. A girl might sort rags by fabric type hemp cotton silk blend. The skills passed down, often quietly. You might never even see the work, but it was happening always in the crevices between stalls and carts. The beauty of it, it was nearly circular. Very little left the system. Almost every scrap moved through hands, changed shape, and re-entered the city's life. Trash wasn't trash. It was just in transition. Even seasonal changes affected it. In summer, trash collectors watched for spoilage-molded paper, sour food waste. In winter, they prepared to sell extra straw wrappings for insulation. Rainy season wet trash needed quick processing to prevent rot. Schedules shifted. Roles adapted. The city had its own tempo, and the trash moved with it like background music. Or maybe more like a second set of hands unseen lifting what everyone else forgot. Now imagine the sun setting. Lanterns flicker on. The market begins to close. Vendors wash down stalls. Trash is bundled, not tossed. It's set aside for those who come next. The carriers, sorters, scrapers, sifters. You realize the garbage collectors aren't the end of the line. They're between lines, connectors, movers, architects of an invisible city within the city. And in the next part of our story, we'll go deeper into that world. Into the homes and workshops where yesterday's trash becomes tomorrow's treasure. Rags become paper. Ash becomes polish. Bone becomes tool. What seemed like the end is only the beginning. The clatter of the morning market fades behind you now, and you step into quieter neighborhoods. Homes line the lanes like shells on a shore, each one housing not just families, but tiny, industrious worlds. And inside those wooden walls, yesterday's garbage is being reborn. It's easy to miss. The signs are small. A curtain pulled back, a whisper of smoke from a side stove, the soft tap-tap of scissors on fabric. But here in these homes and backlot workshops, Ecto's economy of waste becomes transformation. Let's begin with rags. Not the kind you imagine being flung aside, stained, and worthless. An Edo cloth is precious. A cotton kimono doesn't die when it frays. It is reborn again and again. A worn kimono becomes a house robe. That robe, once threadbare, is cut and stitched into a baby's swaddling cloth. When the baby grows, the cloth becomes kitchen rags. When those fray at the seams, they're sold to a papermaker. You see it now, there's no throwaway moment. Each layer is peeled back with care. In the home of a sashiko stitcher, you watch as she layers faded cotton together. She sews lines upon lines of running stitches, beautiful geometric patterns. The cloth becomes stronger, warmer. A worn-out jacket becomes a work coat that can endure wind labor, even snow. Nothing wasted. Even the thread is salvaged, pulled gently from old seams and respun. Children wear hand-me-downs for 5 or 6 generations. A single swatch of dyed indigo might appear on a sleeve in one house, then years later reappear in a quilted futon panel down the street. Cloth travels. But let's go further into a papermaker's home. The raw materials, rags, mulberry bark fibers, and ash. The rags are soaked and beaten into pulp. The ash, especially from hardwoods, is sifted for its alkaline properties and sometimes used to treat the fibers. Even scraps from misfolded origami or used rice paper ledgers are reused. Paper in Edo isn't fragile. It's layered, strong, reusable. Shopkeepers iron it with heated stones to smooth wrinkles. Some types can be oiled to make them waterproof for umbrellas, lanterns, even window panes. And here's the strange part, people sell used paper. Collectors knock at homes asking old letters receipts. Scrap people hand them over. Some of these are shredded and repulped. Others are sorted and sold as kindling. Even torn poetry has a second life. Now turn toward the tiny smithy at the edge of the district. The air smells faintly metallic. The smith's apprentice is sorting nails, some bent, some broken, some rusted. He heats them, straightens them, retempers them. Metal is too valuable to waste. Even the filings from his sharpening stone are swept into a tray and collected for reuse. Spoons, tweezers, clasps, hinges, many are made from scrap. A broken lantern bracket can become a hairpin. Old sword fittings get remelted and turned into tools. And bones. Yes, bones again. In a small shack down the way, an old woman boils them. Not for broth, but for tools. When boiled and scraped, animal bones become smooth and hard. She files them into chopstick, rest buttons, sewing tools, and even dice. Bone dice are popular, especially for back alley gambling. Each item bears a shadow of its former life. But in Edo, that shadow is respected. These are not poor man's goods. They are smart man's goods. The kind of thing your frugal uncle would point at with pride and say, I made this from nothing. Ash is everywhere too, not just paper. Women sift it from cooking hearths and sell it by the bucket. Potters mix it into glaze. Metal workers polish blades with it. Farmers spread it on fields as alkaline fertilizer. A tea house might use fine white ash in its braziers, sculpted to hold charcoal just so. The cleanest ash comes from pine or oak. The worst greasy scrap wood or garbage fires. That ash is used in outhouses or sent off to be compacted into construction filler. Speaking of outhouses, human waste is gold here. Night soil. Already mentioned, yes, but let's go deeper. At the rear of homes you find the kawaya, the household toilet. A wooden box or pit, regularly emptied by the funakichi or waste collectors. These men, usually barefoot, strong, and quiet, come on a schedule. They pay the homeowner, not the other way around. The waste is ladled into large wooden barrels and carted off to the countryside. There it's sold to farmers who treasure it for their rice fields. The farmers even compete for access to neighborhoods with well-fed residents. The richer the diet, the richer the soil. Some areas even have ranked pricing. The waste from samurai households fetches more than from laborers. A strange kind of prestige. The quality of your poop determines its market value. It's all tracked carefully. Now look into a child's toy box. That spinning top made from an old broom handle. The little paper dolls from rice wrapping. The bamboo flute repurposed from a broken gardening stake. Even toys were born of leftovers. In some homes, broken pottery is saved in a box, chipped tea bowls, cracked plates. These aren't trash. They're candidates for kintsugi, the art of golden repair. A cracked dish is mended with lacquer and dusted with gold powder. The flaw becomes part of the beauty. The philosophy. Something broken isn't ruined, it's transformed. That applies to people too. Widows take in sewing work. Retired carpenters teach apprentices using scraps. Even a blind man might work as a paper sorter trained by touch. Everyone finds a loop to belong to. Nothing is ever done. The rag floats to paper. The ash warms the hearth. The bone becomes a sewing needle. The needle stitches a patch. The patch is worn again. The clothes become rags. The rags float again. The city breathes like this inhale-exhale. Garbage in, value out. In the next chapter, we'll follow that breath outward, beyond homes and workshops, to the outer edges of Edo. There, in the industrial zones and controlled dumps, massive systems of repurposing and civic planning hum like machinery. And you'll see that even the most disgusting refuse, the stinkiest, most unlovable scraps, had a place in Edo's clean, strange, orderly dream. The sun sinks lower now, casting long shadows across the horizon, and the hum of the city's internal rhythms begins to shift. From the small, intimate workshops and homes, we move outward to the larger, more industrial areas. These are the spaces where Edo's garbage becomes something larger, where whole systems of disposal, recycling, and repurposing align like gears in a great machine. Outside the heart of the city, there are designated waste districts. These are not places of neglect or filth, but rather organized zones where refuse is processed and transformed. Behind these gates, a different set of workers moves with precision, far from the public eye but indispensable to the city's very existence. Here, the detritus of Edo's daily life is sorted on a grand scale. One such district is the Gomi-yama, or Trash Mountain, a place where everything from household waste to industrial scrap is sorted and repurposed. There's no mystery here. The workers, the Gomi-sha, are a distinct group, often from rural villages or lower classes. They're not part of the higher status trades, but are respected for their role in the city's infrastructure. They live in nearby slums and small communities bound by their shared purpose of recycling. Gomi-yama is like a great sprawling marketplace, but instead of vendors hawking goods, the items here are relics of a life already lived. Some piles consist of torn clothing, others of broken wooden crates, shattered ceramics, and discarded tools. Each pile has a specific destination, a precise fate. An old farmer might sift through the rags to find material for stuffing in his cushions or patching his roof. A carpenter might take the cracked wood planet smooth and reuse it for a new piece of furniture. Nothing is left untouched. In the heart of Gomi-yama stands a massive kiln. It's a furnace for melting down ceramics, broken glass, and metal objects that can no longer be salvaged in their current form. The kilns work day and night, turning yesterday's refuse into today's commodity. The smoke that rises from them carries the scent of ash and transformation. It's the scent of Edo's industrial engine grinding along at full capacity, but to the people who work here, it's just another day of making something from nothing. The kiln workers are a different breed, rough, sturdy people used to heat and smoke. Their skin is marked by the heavy ash that coats the air. It's an exhausting job. but for those who work the kilns, it offers a certain sense of pride. They aren't just burning things away, they're creating something new. They're helping the cycle continue. Whether it's pottery, glassware, or metal tools, these kilns serve as the point where the old and the new meet. As the refuse comes in, it's sorted meticulously. Rags are separated from wood, and paper bone is saved for jewelry or fishing hooks, and glass is checked for imperfections. Even broken pottery isn't left to waste. A special group of artisans called kintsugi masters work in these districts, taking damaged or cracked ceramics and repairing them with lacquer dusted with gold. What was once broken becomes something treasured. And all around this system of organized chaos are the mizusha, the water workers. They manage the city's water waste, the sewage, and the runoff from kitchens and bathhouses. You see, in Edo, water was too valuable to simply let go. The water that flowed through the city's canals was constantly monitored. Some of it was directed into the fields for irrigation, while other water was treated for reuse in various industries. The mizusha were in charge of keeping it all flowing smoothly, ensuring that even the city's sewage didn't become a problem, but instead worked its way back into Edo's efficient system. On the edge of Gomiyama, the outskirts of the district begin to show signs of industry. Large workshops where broken iron is reforged into new tools. These workshops work in tandem with the trash collection system, creating an environment where waste not only serves the city's needs, but becomes a foundation for growth. Iron, once scrap, becomes new metal products for the city's craftsmen. The scraps of metal from one workshop flow into the next, reinforcing a never-ending loop. There's also the bustling district of Chikugo, where old fish bones and animal waste are used to make fertilizer. Local farmers buy this recycled compost to help grow crops in the fertile fields around Edo. The city, ever mindful of its resources, ensures that even its filth and waste end up as sustenance. Every village on the outskirts benefits from this system. The food waste doesn't vanish into nothing, it's composted and used to nourish the earth. The bones that were once discarded help to grow the food that will feed the people of Edo, and in turn, they'll produce more waste for the cycle to continue. But as efficient as this system is, it's not without its difficulties. There's an inherent messiness to it all, a constant flow of material moving through different hands, constantly at risk of slipping through the cracks. The larger the system becomes, the harder it is to keep track of every little piece. But despite this, the basic philosophy of the city remains clear: waste doesn't exist in Edo. There is only material that's awaiting its next step. In fact, in many ways, the city's success is built on this very idea. The constant reuse and recycling of materials have allowed Edo to flourish. Where other cities might have crumbled under the weight of their refuse, Edo has thrived because it learned the art of using everything and nothing goes to waste. Take a deep breath. You can almost smell the mixture of burning wood, freshly sifted ash, and cooking rice from the nearby homes. The air is warm from the work being done from the endless loop of creation. There's no stopping the rhythm. Even as you look out toward the distant horizon where the water is glistening and the city's lights begin to twinkle, you can feel the pulse of Edo continuing. But the strange thing is, this system is not just the city's backbone, it's also its heartbeat. The idea that everything has a place, that nothing is left behind, is what sustains this vibrant metropolis. The final pieces of the puzzle are always being added, transformed, and woven into the fabric of Edo life. And in the next chapter, we'll follow that final piece of the journey, exploring the higher reaches of Edo's garbage economy and how it evolved to support the needs of the city's growing population. What began as a simple cycle of reuse will become something even greater, an intricate dance that moves from the smallest alleyways to the grandest palaces. Dawn breaks gently over Edo, casting golden light across the rooftops. The city is already awake. Porters shuffle through narrow streets, shutters creak open, and merchants lay out their wares. But today, instead of following the usual rhythm of daily life, we climb higher. Not physically, I know hills or castle towers, but socially through the upper layers of the garbage economy. You see, while the commoners patched and passed along their things with admirable efficiency, the elite of Edo, the samurai, the merchants, even the nobles played their part too. Their relationship with garbage was different. It wasn't that they didn't produce waste. Quite the opposite. Their lives generated more of it. But their status demanded they pretend otherwise. Take the samurai class. Their homes were often large with manicured gardens and quiet sliding doors, but inside the daily life of a samurai household was filled with excess. Lavish meals, elaborate clothing paper correspondence, ceremonial incense, seasonal decorations, all beautiful, all fleeting. Behind the elegance was a steady stream of cast-offs, food scraps, worn tatami mats, cracked ceramics, chipped lacquerware, and so in service to them a quiet army of specialists emerged: the discreet cleaners, the silent collectors, the ash sorters and scrap haulers. These weren't the rag pickers you saw in the city core. These were contracted workers, sometimes hereditary, known by name, to the household, often entering through side gates and working at dawn or dusk to avoid being seen. They operated with almost ceremonial precision. Waste was sorted immediately, nothing left to rot, nothing to pile up. Old scrolls were bundled and burned in private. Broken fans disassembled for parts. Candle drippings collected and recast. Even old incense ash was gathered and resold to perfumers who could blend it into new aromatic products. And this, curiously, was where the garbage of the wealthy met the ambition of the poor. Items discarded by a noblewoman might find their way through a dozen quiet transactions to a market stall on the edge of town, where a merchant's daughter buys a used kimono sleeve, thrilled to own something that once graced a lady of rank. This trade was unofficial but powerful. The downward drift of elite objects created a trickle of luxury through the lower classes. Bits of silk-chipped porcelain, once expensive fans, each piece retaining some of its previous dignity. And because so much value still clung to these cast-offs, they were handled with care. Even the ink-stained paper of an old letter could become something. In one part of town, an elderly man collects such papers and makes them into shikishi decorative paperboards for poetry and calligraphy practice. He carefully slices away the margins, glues layers together, and irons them flat. A young poet might compose their first verse on what was once a samurai's grocery list. Further up the social ladder, we reach the merchant class, wealthy, shrewd, and extremely conscious of appearances. Their shops gleam with fine woods and polished brass. But behind the scenes, their operations generate huge volumes of packaging waste rice, straw paper wrappings, broken crates, cracked tiles from shipping damage. The cleverest merchants didn't see this as trash. They saw it as inventory. They employed staff whose only job was to repurpose waste. Straw from rice bags became sandals or stuffing. Crate wood was stripped of nails and rebuilt into stools or kindling. Even the powder from shattered tea bowls was sold to potters as filler for glaze. These merchants knew the rules of Edo's economy: waste equals cost. Anything thrown out was money lost, so they built in recycling systems, hiring artisans to work in basements and back rooms. In some districts, entire warehouse blocks hummed with quiet labor, not just making goods, but remaking them. And if something couldn't be reused directly, it entered the barter chain. Merchants traded their broken ceramics to kintsugi masters in exchange for repairs. Or they bartered old shop banners with a papermaker who pulped them into thick ledgers. The value chain was fluid. Nothing stood still. Now let's consider the cultural elite, the poets, honest scholars, and artists. Their waste was almost sacred. Calligraphy scraps, dried brushes, woodblock printing plates, used inkstones, all of it was handled with reverence. Broken brushes were sometimes given to students as keepsakes. Woodblock printing scraps were collected by other artists for collages. Even the shavings from carved printing blocks could end up in children's art kits. Parents believed that letting kids paint on reused paper or sketch with leftover charcoal taught humility and creativity. There was no shame in reusing something touched by greatness. And then there were the temples and shrines. These places produced ceremonial waste, ash, incense, remains, burnt offerings. But even here, the cycle of reuse held sway. Ash from incense was sold to perfumers or used to polish temple floors. Old robes from monks were cut and sewn into rags for cleaning sacred statues. The rope from festival decorations was unraveled and rewoven into household ties. Nothing was discarded casually. Some temples even ran their own recycling centers, collecting donated goods from worshippers, old clothes, broken tools, unused furniture, and distributing them to the poor. The temple grounds were not just spiritual sanctuaries, but places where Edo's material life found renewal. One particular practice stands out: the Osame Fuda, a ritual in which old talismans, amulets, and charms were returned to the temple and burned at year's end. The ashes weren't scattered at random. They were carefully gathered and, in some temples, mixed into clay to make new amulet tablets. A full cycle. Faith into fire into form. And then, of course, there were the official collectors. These were licensed by the city to manage larger-scale waste operations, bulk paper collection, fabric salvage, industrial scrap sorting. These collectors paid fees for the right to operate and were expected to handle their territories with diligence. They worked closely with ward officials who tracked collection routes, regulated reselling, and enforced order. If a collector was found hoarding too much or letting piles accumulate dangerously, they could lose their license. The city had no patience for disorder. Edo was too dense, too full of people to tolerate waste going rogue. So here at the top layers of the garbage system, what do we find? Not carelessness, not avoidance, but an intricate choreography. A shared agreement from the palace to the paper stall that every object has a path. That value can be extended indefinitely. And as you drift gently now through this thought, let's prepare to head downward again. Not just back into the streets, but into the future. Because even as Edo's systems reached their peak, cracks were beginning to show. Growth brought pressure. New ideas challenged old ones. What happens when a city so proud of its order starts to feel the strain of modernity? We'll face that next, how Edo's clean dream began to creak and strain beneath the weight of change. The sky over Edo is beginning to shift. Not with the coming of night or change in season, but something deeper, more unsettling. The rhythm of life that had pulsed in perfect order for centuries begins at last to stutter. You don't notice it all at once. It comes slowly like water slipping under a door. And yet little by little, Edo's famously orderly garbage system begins to feel the pressure of change. The roots of this pressure lie not in the trash itself, but in the city's growth. By the early 1800s, Edo had become one of the largest urban centers in the world, with a population exceeding 1 million people. That means 1 million bowls to be cleaned, 1 million ink brushes scratching across paper, 1 million pairs of sandals slapping through muddy streets. And each of those lives produced waste. Even in a city that recycled everything, the sheer volume was becoming a problem. The infrastructure, once elegantly interlocked, began to fray. Garbage collectors found themselves overwhelmed by demand. Rag pickers were competing for scraps that used to be easy to find. Gomi-yama, once a symbol of efficiency, became choked with overflow. Storage areas reached capacity faster than items could be sorted or sold. It was like watching a perfectly choreographed dance fall slightly out of step. The ward offices tried to keep up. More collectors were licensed. Routes were redrawn. Regulations were revised. But the bureaucratic gears, once so smoothly turning, now ground against one another. People complained. There were whispers in the streets about the smell, about the piles of unsorted trash outside shops, about the rats returning. In a city once defined by its cleanliness, these were not just nuisances. They were insults to the very identity of Edo, and deeper still, there was a shift in values. The old system worked because people believed in it. They accepted the rules, the hierarchies, the economy of second chances. But the late Edo period saw the beginning of cracks in this worldview. Exposure to Western ideas, the growing influence of global trade and a generation coming of age during economic hardship, all of these combined to make people question what had once been sacred. Younger craftsmen started to view used goods as burdens rather than resources. Merchants, once meticulous about reusing every crate and wrapping, began importing cheap packaging from abroad. It wasn't made to last, and it wasn't meant to be reused. It was disposable, and that was the point. New started to mean better, and suddenly old things lost a bit of their magic. There were other signs of the shift. Public baths, once strict about waste management, grew lax. Festival cleanups, once community affairs, saw declining participation. And among the upper classes, displays of wealth shifted. Instead of prized kintsugi bowls with their golden seams, the trend turned toward perfectly pristine, imported porcelain white flawless, untouched by human repair. Even the language began to reflect the change. Where people once used the term motenai, A word expressing regret at wasting something newer, slang crept in signaling impatience with frugality. Waste began to feel less like a moral failing and more like a side effect of progress. And progress, of course, was coming fast. In the 1850s, the arrival of Commodore Perry's black ships forced open Japan's borders, ending more than 2 centuries of isolation. The Meiji Restoration, not far off now, would sweep across the nation like a wildfire. Western clothing, Western machines, Western waste. Where once a pot was used for 3 generations now, a steel can arrived that could not be repaired, and no one yet knew what to do with it. This foreign influence didn't just introduce new materials, it brought new mindsets. A disposable culture powered by industrial mass production crept into Edo's careful ecosystem. Tools and goods were now produced in factories, not workshops. They were uniform, cheap, and easily replaced, and when they broke well, they went into the ground. That was new. Remember, Edo didn't have landfills in the modern sense. Trash was always part of the flow, burned, reused, composted. But now, for the first time, people began to bury things in unused fields near riverbanks and hastily dug pits outside the city. The earth, once nourished by compost, now held remnants that would never rot. Oil tins, glass fragments, nails, chemical dyes. And slowly the city changed. You can still hear the sounds of the past bamboo brooms, sweeping alleyways, wooden carts, creaking under sacks of sorted trash, but they're fainter now, buried under the noise of new construction, new machines, new ambitions. Edo is still beautiful, still orderly in its own way, but the old rhythms are being replaced. The city is like a great wheel that's been spinning too fast, starting to wobble. Yet even in the midst of all this upheaval, some people resist. You meet an old Kajiya, a blacksmith who still collects broken nails from the streets, melting them down into hinges and tools. You see a grandmother pulling thread from a worn-out kimono, planning to sew it into doll clothes for her granddaughter. You visit a tiny shop that still offers kintsugi repairs, its back room filled with golden cracks and quiet defiance. But these are acts of memory now, not economy. The great system that once sustained a city is starting to falter under the weight of its own success and the flood of new influences. Garbage, once a resource, is starting to feel like a problem. And with that shift comes a change in how people see their world. It's not just about keeping streets clean. It's about what you value and what you're willing to let go. And maybe that's the heart of it. Edo's system wasn't just about waste. It was about a belief that nothing is useless, that everything can serve again, that beauty and purpose don't end when something breaks. That belief is being tested now, perhaps even fading. But it hasn't vanished completely, because cities like people don't change all at once. They bend, they shift, they forget, and then sometimes they remember. And as the light dims on this era, we move now toward its final twilight. In the next chapter, we'll follow Edo's descent into the Meiji period and how a city built on circular use was swept into a straight line of progress. There, we'll watch the final delicate collapse of one of the most sophisticated garbage systems the world has ever known. The lamps flicker softly in the back streets of late Edo, casting long, uncertain shadows. The city that once hummed with perfect rhythm is now offbeat, like a clock that ticks too quickly in some places, too slowly in others. We're nearing the edge of the Tokugawa shogunate of the Edo period, and of an era defined not just by samurai and cherry blossoms, but by a philosophy of waste that touched every corner of life. This final phase doesn't collapse all at once. It's a slow unraveling, a quiet undoing. One law changes. One technology arrives. One habit disappears. And little by little, the living organism that was Edo's garbage economy begins to break apart. It begins with the Meiji Restoration of 1868, when imperial rule is restored, and Edo itself is renamed Tokyo Eastern Capital. The name change is more than symbolic. It marks the start of a full transformation. Feudal class structures are abolished. Samurai lose their stipends. Foreign advisors arrive bringing railways, printing presses, gas lights, and with them, a completely foreign relationship to material goods. One of the first things to go is the web of hereditary collectors. These trash haulers, night soil men, Scrap buyers, once indispensable, are now seen as remnants of an old, inefficient world. The government, eager to modernize, begins replacing them with centralized systems inspired by European models. By the 1870s, Tokyo hires French and German engineers to help design sewers and waterworks. Night soil, once collected daily and turned into gold for the farms, is now redirected toward municipal sewage systems. Composting slows. Trade in human waste declines. The nutrient loop that once connected city and countryside starts to sever, and with that cut comes a cascade. Farmers who once relied on city fertilizer must now pay for imported chemical alternatives. The cost of farming rises. At the same time, Tokyo's waste, no longer separated, sorted, or valued, accumulates. Lacking proper treatment systems, refuse piles up in rivers, ditches, and alleyways. Complaints rise. Disease follows. Public health officials respond, but not with the old ethos of reuse. They push for incineration and landfill. In 1875, Tokyo begins experimenting with centralized burning of trash, a system that would have shocked the waste pickers of Edo. Burning something useful, unthinkable. But the thinking now is different speed sanitation scale. Factories have begun to appear on the edges of the city, churning out textiles, paper goods, metal tools. These items are cheaper than the handmade equivalents of old, and they break more easily. Worse, they're not designed for repair. The joinery is too thin, the thread too weak, the ink too fast fading. So when something fails, it's not patched, it's pitched. You feel the shift in everyday life. A shopkeeper once proud to display carefully restored pots now sells imported enameled cups, disposable and identical. A mother who once taught her child to mend holes now buys new socks when the old ones tear. Not because she's lazy, because it's cheaper. Because that's how the system now works. Schools start teaching hygiene, not repair. Modern households are taught to clean by removing, throwing out broken things, outdated tools, clutter. Reuse, once a virtue, becomes associated with poverty. To be modern is to consume cleanly and continuously. You might still see vestiges of the old way. A cart vendor reusing rice straw cords. An old couple sweeping their alley with bundled twigs. A child playing with a toy made from packaging scraps. But they are no longer the rule. They are quaint. They are folklore. The final blow comes with industrial packaging. Glass bottles with metal caps. Paper boxes sealed with wax. Imported canned goods from Europe. These containers aren't just hard to repurpose, they're designed not to be. The shift from circular to linear waste accelerates. By the 1880s, Tokyo's streets begin to resemble something more familiar to the modern eye. Dump sites appear. Slums grow. The wealth gap widens. In place of Edo's decentralized ecosystem of collectors, brokers, and repairers, the city now depends on municipal workers, scheduled pickups, and incinerators. Some historians try to trace a single moment, an inflection point, when the culture of Matanai regret at waste gave way to modern indifference. But it's more like a tide. It rises silently until you realize your feet are wet. There are attempts to resist. Some townspeople start repair co-ops. Certain temples continue to hold used goods exchanges, blessing old tools and passing them on. Small artisan groups still train in Edo-style recycling, kintsugi paper, mending, cloth weaving. But their influence fades beneath the roar of factories and the glow of gaslights. In 1884, the Tokyo government issues its first modern waste regulation, requiring households to sort combustibles and non-combustibles. It's a good idea, but it's telling. For the first time in centuries, the government must teach people how to handle waste. What was once intuitive now needs enforcement. You walk through a back street past a wall of broken furniture stacked behind a shop. In Edo, this pile would have vanished by morning, hauled, stripped, repurposed. But now it sits, waiting for the trash wagon, or a storm. And so we find ourselves at the end of a cycle. The city of Edo, once a paragon of waste-free living, is now Tokyo, a city in transition, part gleaming future, part forgotten past. The old wisdom hasn't vanished, but it's gone underground, stored in memories, echoed in old phrases, sleeping perhaps until the world remembers why it mattered. It's easy to think of progress as a straight line forward, but sometimes the past had answers we've only just begun to forget. In the next chapter, we'll trace the strange legacy Edo left behind, how its ghost still lingers in modern Japan's waste practices, and how some of its ancient garbage logic may just be making a comeback. The dawn of the 20th century arrives with the buzz of electric streetcars and the clatter of modern Tokyo, forging its identity from the bones of Edo. But even as glass towers rise and chimneys pump out plumes of coal smoke, something curious begins to happen. Pieces of Edo's waste system, its ancient logic, its stubborn frugality, its rituals of reuse don't entirely vanish. They hibernate, they shift, and then unexpectedly they reemerge. You begin to notice it in the countryside first. Rural villages slower to modernize still rely on many Edo period practices. Farmers continue to compost kitchen scraps, reuse containers, and pass down tools across generations. Night soil, though regulated now, is still traded in some areas. Elders remember sorting everything metal from paper bone from wood, and they pass that instinct to their children. Even as cities chase modernity, the rural heart of Japan remains quietly tied to the old ways. In Tokyo itself, after the devastation of the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923, a strange kind of rebirth occurs. The city must be rebuilt from rubble, and in that necessity, reuse becomes paramount. Bricks are salvaged wood, repurposed clothing shared. It's not Edo style by choice, it's Edo style by need. The disaster becomes an unexpected echo of the old system. When you must make do with what you have, waste becomes unthinkable. But it's during the Second World War and its aftermath that Edo's logic fully reasserts itself. Wartime shortages mean that everything, literally everything, is saved. The government issues strict rationing laws. Housewives boil peach pits for cooking oil. Newspapers are repurposed into insulation. School children collect scrap metal for the war effort. Entire communities band together to repair, recycle, and reuse because survival depends on it. And it's not just about necessity, it's about habit. Japan, shaped for centuries by Edo's closed-loop economy, already knows how to live this way. The rhythms are still buried in the culture. So even in war, something remarkable happens. The systems of reuse come back to life. After the war, Tokyo lies in ruins again, but so does its enemy, consumerism. The West begins pumping in aid food and mass-produced goods. Slowly, Tokyo rebuilds this time around an American-style economy. Plastic enters the market. Packaging gets brighter, bulkier. Convenience becomes a selling point. Still, the Edo spirit doesn't vanish. In the 1950s and 60s, Japan's government introduces organized recycling campaigns not out of environmentalism, but out of necessity. Resources are scarce. Steel, copper, and glass are collected by citizens in programs eerily reminiscent of Edo's tinkerers and scrap buyers. Even the phrase motenai returns to the public vocabulary. Children are taught not to waste rice. Old clothes are refashioned. Leftover food is composted in household bins. One Ministry of Health campaign even shows a cartoon banana peel, transforming into fertilizer and returning as a new fruit. Sound familiar? Meanwhile, Edo-era garbage wisdom becomes a subject of academic interest. Anthropologists begin studying historical waste practices, surprised to discover how sophisticated the systems were. Tokyo's museums begin displaying compost buckets, rag patching tools, and ceramic repair kits as artifacts not of poverty but of ingenuity. In the 1970s, the first environmental movements in Japan take root. Pollution in major cities leads to public backlash, and suddenly the philosophy of sustainable living is no longer backward, it's visionary. Activists and thinkers begin to reframe Edo not as a relic of a pre-modern age, but as a model of ecological urbanism. They argue that Edo wasn't just efficient, it was wise. It understood cycles, it respected limits. It built systems where waste had no place because everything had a role. That thinking begins to influence policy. By the 1990s, Japan boasts one of the most advanced recycling systems in the world. Municipalities enforce strict separation of trash. Burnable, non-burnable PET bottles, paper, glass, metals, all collected separately. Penalties are issued for mixing categories. And who does the sorting? Not machines. You, the citizen, just like in Edo. In fact, many of the principles that guided Edo's waste logic are now codified into law producer responsibility. You make it, you take it back. Packaging reduction, reuse incentives, waste to energy plants, resource loops, municipal composting, and a culture where people still apologize for wasting food paper or time. Not because of guilt, because of matanai, the feeling that you've disrespected the spirit of a thing. Today, Japan recycles more than 80% of its plastic bottles. Kitchen waste is collected for pig feed and fertilizer. Electronics are disassembled, sorted, and rebuilt. Used clothing is repurposed or exported. Schools teach children how to fold and store snack wrappers for proper disposal. Apartment buildings post detailed waste calendars. In many places, garbage is collected only if it is correctly sorted and tagged. But maybe the most Edo thing of all is the quiet pride people take in it. Not flashy, not dramatic, just a daily commitment to getting it right. Wrapping garbage in newspaper, washing recyclables before tossing them, bundling twigs with twine, sweeping sidewalks. You're not saving the world, you're just doing what's right. And now, something remarkable is happening. The world is paying attention. Cities around the globe, from San Francisco to Stockholm, are studying Edo-style systems. Books are written. Documentaries produced. Urban planners and environmental scientists come to Japan not just to see its high-tech marvels, but to understand how a 17th century city handled waste without creating any. There's even talk of Edo futurism, a vision where past and future meet in closed-loop harmony. So here we are, centuries after the garbage boats first floated down the Sumida River. The city has changed names, grown taller, become louder. But beneath the skyscrapers and neon, a quiet rhythm still hums: sort, repair, reuse, respect. The garbage might not look the same, but the logic, the beauty of order, the elegance of cycles, the refusal to throw things away just because they're broken, that logic lives on. And as we prepare to close this story, one question remains. In a world drowning in trash, could the past, this strange, orderly, sometimes obsessive past, be the future we've been searching for? The moon hangs heavy above modern Tokyo, casting light not just on the shiny glass of high-rises, but on the quiet corners where the Edo spirit lingers, where order, reuse, and an almost poetic restraint still shape the way people deal with things. Most of us would rather ignore our trash. And so, as you stretch out under your blanket eyelids, softening with the weight of the journey, we arrive at the final part of this strange tale, not about garbage, really, but about what garbage says about us. Edo's waste system wasn't born from love of nature. That would be a romantic lie. It was born from constraint. Japan was an island with limited arable land, limited timber, limited everything. What Edo had in abundance was people and systems that kept them in check. So the city learned to live within limits, and in doing so, it stumbled into sustainability. It wasn't always kind. It wasn't always fair. But it was astonishingly efficient. Every household, every merchant, every farmer, every outcast had a role to play in the grand theater of circulation. There was no way to throw things. There was only somewhere else. Someone else. You've walked with the night soil men, and rag pickers paused at the compost heaps, and recycling brokers lingered in the stalls of used goods markets and listened to the calls of paper buyers echo through narrow lanes. Now, as the Ecto period comes to a close and the modern world roars to life, it's worth asking what was gained and what was lost. The modern garbage system offers ease. You toss a plastic container and someone comes to take it away. You don't see where it goes. You don't feel its weight. You don't think about whether it still has life left in it. That's the gift and the danger. In Edo, everyone knew the journey of their waste. The streets weren't clean because someone swept them. They were clean because the sweepers were neighbors known and named. The buckets weren't emptied because of a contract, but because of a relationship. A city like that breathes differently. And maybe that's what's missing. We think of waste as an engineering problem, a technological hurdle. But Edo shows us it's something deeper. Waste is cultural. It's emotional. It's tied to how we value things, how we see labor, how we think about responsibility. When you know the name of the person who will handle what you discard differently. Today, there's talk of zero waste cities, of circular economies, of sustainable futures. These are good things. But they are also echoes distant and sometimes distorted of something that once was simply normal. You can see it in the Motonai revival campaigns, in Kyoto's flea markets at temple grounds, in the tradition of furoshiki cloth wrapping, which turns packaging into art, in children's crafts that reuse bottle caps and cartons, in old aunties who still save the twist ties from bread bags and fold plastic grocery bags into triangles neat as origami cranes. There's a kind of grace in it. Not shame, not austerity. Grace. The grace of slowing down, of asking, what is this thing I'm about to toss? Could it live again? Could it serve someone else? Could its strange thought be beautiful? That doesn't mean going backward. Edo wasn't perfect. It was rigid, hierarchical, closed off in many ways. But it does mean listening. It means honoring what it got right. The ritual, the rhythm, the restraint. Even now, Tokyo struggles with waste like every megacity. Landfills are running out. Plastic mountains rise. Food waste piles up. But in the cracks of modern life, Edo peeks through. A neighborhood holds a Motonai fair, where people exchange old goods without money. A child learns how to patch their socks instead of tossing them. A salaryman too proud to litter walks 3 blocks with an empty can until he finds a recycling bin. A restaurant composts its scraps for the rooftop garden. These are not innovations. They're old wisdom returning home. And maybe that's what the story of Edo's garbage is really about. Not a system, not even a city, but a way of seeing the world in which nothing, no scrap of paper, no leftover rice, no broken bowl is without value. A world where even garbage has a name, a place, a path. So tonight as you drift off, maybe you'll carry that thought with you. That nothing you touch is truly disposable. That everything belongs to someone, somewhere, sometime. And that sometimes the best way forward is to remember what we almost forgot.